The Supreme Court of the United States is currently based in one of the most ostentatious and exquisite structures in the nation. It is a resplendent stone palace etched with prominent mottos and evocative maxims, enveloped in imposing effigies and marble carvings. It is, in the words of one scholar, modeled on a Greek temple and intended as a shrine to the majesty of the law. Its face boasts 16 huge Corinthian columns topped by a pediment with Lady Liberty enthroned in the center, who holds the scales of justice and is flanked by order on the one side and authority on the other. There are 6 different kinds of marble, sourced domestically from Vermont, Georgia, and Alabama, and internationally from Algeria, Alicante, and Siena, along with hundreds of panels of American white oak, coating the grand, elegant, and august edifice. Even the elevator doors and fire hose cupboards are cast from beaming bronze, and the walls of the courtroom itself brandish the images of Menes, Hammurabi, Muhammad, Charlemagne, John Marshall, King Solomon, and Moses himself. And the complex is not without its extravagances, including a mini gymnasium and a basketball court on the top floor, affectionately referred to by staff, I understand, as the highest court in all the land. But the Supreme Court did not always look this way. The current structure was only completed in 1935, and before that the justices met in the Capitol building itself. Until 1860, they met in a room underneath the Senate, in what was a dark, dingy, cramped basement that felt like a cellar and was nearly impossible to find. The space was so constricted that the justices were compelled to don their robes in the courtroom, which led to a spectacle that in many ways undercut the very purpose of the gowns in the first place. One justice of the age called that spot a potato hole of a place, and a journalist of the era once wrote that a visitor might traverse the dark halls of the Capitol for weeks without finding the remote corner in which justice is administered in the American Republic. The only defense that anyone could offer for the absurd arrangement was that perhaps it symbolized how justice should underlie legislation. But eventually, after some renovations, repairs, and expansions, the courtroom moved to the old Senate chamber, which was a little larger and better ventilated than the basement, while also extending some dignity to the justices, who now also had a robing room outside the court. And it was actually President Taft, the only person in history to serve as both president and then Chief Justice, who petitioned Congress for funding to construct the Supreme Court its own building, against the resistances of a number of other justices and nearly all of the Senate, with the exception of one senator who apparently wanted to use one of the justices' office for himself. And Taft made the case that as a separate branch of government, the Supreme Court had no place in the legislature and warranted, even symbolically, a space of its own, which is where it sits to this day, away from the Speaker and the President and the leader of the Senate. Which brings us to a profound observation made by our sages as they gleaned between the lines of the sacred text that we read over the course of the last 2 weeks. At the end of Parashat Yitro, in the wake of Revelation last week, without any apparent rhyme or reason, we read a range of rules about the altar, including a prohibition on constructing steps or employing metal in its construction. And from that, we went to this week, where we begin with a list of regulations pertaining to civic law and social order, Elah Mishpatim. And on the basis of this otherwise mysterious and inexplicable juxtaposition, our sages infer a central and inflexible tenet of Jewish institutional architecture. Lama nismecha parashat dinim leparashat mizbeach? Ask our sages, why are the passages about laws, about Mishpatim, connected or conjoined with a passage about the altar, the Mizbeach, and the lesson that they learn is Shahaita Sanhedrin Gedola Eitzel HaMizbeach, to teach that the Jewish Supreme Court ought to be situated next to the altar. Cited by Rashi and endorsed across the board, this inference of our sages is seen as visionary and universal, and this is our question. Why? For what purpose would heaven insist that the high court sit alongside the site of sacrifice? What notion lies behind this undisputed architectonic juxtaposition? And there are three discrete views that I'd like to share with you today, starting with the profoundly symbolic view of the Maharal of Prague. Much as some defended the United States Supreme Court sitting beneath the Senate as a symbol of justice, as the foundation of legislation, and others advocated for a separate building as a symbol of the distinction between the executive and the judiciary, the man who legend says awoke a golem sees the mandated adjacency and physical contiguity between the court and the altar as a signal of deep and abiding institutional affinity. For the Maharal, both the court and the altar are vehicles of harmony. In his words, Mizbeach mesim shalom ben Yisrael lavim shabashamayim. The altar makes peace between the people and our Father in heaven. Mishpatim mitilim shalom ba'olam, and laws make peace between people on earth. So for him, the altar and the court, though in radically different ways, both ensure domestic bliss. Religious rites sustain the bond between God and the nation, and laws preserve order and keep the peace. But there is a second perspective, which can be found in the writings of the Moravian-born early modern rabbinic leader of Mainz, Rabbi Chaim Bachrach, known by the title of his commentary, the Chavot Yair. And as a renowned decisor of Jewish law, he knew that urgent questions with high stakes necessitate a near instantaneous response. However valuable deliberations and ruminations and cogitation may be, when lives or livelihoods are on the line, the faster an answer arrives, the better. And he implies, in the life of the nation, there may be no higher stakes in our connection with God. So doubts about the status of a temple rite or religious ritual could paralyze society. And it is for that reason alone, he says, that the sages of the Supreme Court needed to be in the vicinity of the altar to facilitate a rapid response time for ritual emergencies. This architectural obligation for the Chavot Yair is in some ways the ancient equivalent of putting the justices on speed dial. But there is a third and final view that I'd like to share with you, one that sees the necessary proximity between sacrifices and the sages, between the Sanhedrin and the Mizbeach, as both more urgent than an intangible symbol and impossible to replace with a phone line. Perhaps the sages needed to be seated near the Mizbeach not to represent an institutional alignment or to expedite the resolution of ritual crises, but so that they could see with their own eyes the real lives of the people for whom they arbitrated cases and settled law. The altar was not simply a site of routine priestly ritual. It was a space where you could come face to face with citizens from every walk of life and every place in society. In many ways, the Mizbeach was the crossroads of the nation. On an average day, you might see a man offering thanks for surviving an expedition and another confessing a terrible sin. You might see a new mother bringing a sacrifice in the wake of the birth of her baby and another fulfilling a vow that she took too lightly. You might see a married couple making a last effort to heal their wounds, or a recent convert celebrating the embrace of their new nation. You would see the young and the old, the rich and the needy, the liked and the lonely. Though the temple was a sober place and often a quiet one, it was not vacant nor bare. It bore the stories of a whole people and carried their memories for all to see. So perhaps our sages saw beneath the odd juxtaposition in our sacred text a suggestion that if judges are to serve with integrity, they need to develop sensitivity to their constituency. They need to see the people whose lives rely on their rulings, whose guilt and innocence hangs on their findings, whose fortune follows their call. Martha Nussbaum, a professor of law and ethics with an expertise in the classics, is an ardent defender of the humanities who argues that it is stories, more than anything else, that humanize and train us to see through others' eyes. And she insists that even more than the average citizen, judges have a responsibility to read poetry and history and fiction, to furnish their minds with as much human feeling as possible. because they who weigh the fate of the accused and assess the pain of the wounded need to attune their senses to the depths of the human condition. In her words, to be fully rational, judges must also be capable of sympathy. They must educate not only their technical capacities, but also their capacity for humanity. To accurately and honestly and equitably and impartially adjudicate cases and evaluate culpability, a judge needs to be able to envisage or imagine another reality and identify with the variety of beating hearts before them in court. So perhaps this is why the Sanhedrin had to sit with the altar in their eye line, not simply to be on call or to serve as a mere symbol, but to shape their sympathies through their exposure to the canvas of humanity. As they arbitrated cases and interpreted the law, they could not be solitary scholars in an ivory tower, but needed to see real people in the throes of life. People who failed and thrived and smiled and cried, committed crimes and performed acts of kindness and came to God for aid and compassion. Our sacred spaces, our shuls, are more than just places for personal prayer. They bring us together to deepen our awareness of our neighbor's needs and dreams and realities. So as we stand next to each other, when we get the chance to stand next to each other, let us also get to understand each other and live our lives in ways that make space for us all to thrive as one. I wish you all a Shavua Tov.